All right, I got this article from Russell Dean Landers. It's one page, and we'll just read it. It's News 9 briefing inside Guantanamo North. Boston bomber Dzhokhar Sarnov has been sent to a maximum security federal prison in Terre, Haute, Indiana. What's it like? Who ends up in this prison? Home to federal death row, the maximum security penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, boasts a menacing mix of terrorists, serial killers, white supremacists, and child molesters. Enemy combatant John Walker Lind and the so-called American Taliban. John Walker Lind, the so-called American Taliban, will be one of Sarnov's new neighbors. So too will Abduwali Moose, one of the Somali pirates who took on Captain Richard Phillips. The facility is also home to the execution chamber where Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh met his end in 2001. Sarnov, 21, is currently appealing his sentence to avoid that fate, but while he does so, federal death row's newest and youngest member will probably spend at least a decade in a facility so restrictive it's earned the nickname Guantanamo North. Sister Rita Claire Gerardeau, an activist who has worked with death row inmates, said prisoners are kept isolated in tiny cells all day with almost no human contact. Truthfully, I don't know how they keep their sanity. What's inside Terre Haute? There are two special units. Sarnov is likely to be placed in the Special Confinement Unit, SCU, built in 1993 to house federal death row inmates. Details on the prisons are scarce, but inmates are believed to spend almost every waking minute in their cells, furnished with a bed, shower, desk, toilet, sink, and 13-inch television. Sister Rita reported that inmates went outside for just 5 hours a week, and even then, usually only to wander into designated cages to exercise and take a peek at the sky. One inmate found those conditions so hellish that the ACLU that he volunteered for execution. Sarnov might end up in the Communications Management Unit, a special 50-cell facility for terrorists and other dangerous prisoners. The inmates there are remotely watched and monitored every minute of every day by a team of intelligence officials in West Virginia. That unit and other isolation units were designed to keep terrorists from radicalizing other inmates or slipping dangerous messages to fellow terrorists outside. Are all terrorists sent there? No. Had Sarnov avoided the death penalty, he could have served a life sentence at the only federal supermax in the country, ADX Florence in Colorado, nicknamed Alcatraz of the Rockies. ADX houses some of America's most notorious criminals, including Unabomber Ted Kaczynski and shoe bomber Richard Reed. There, inmates spend 23 hours a day in a concrete cell averaging 12 feet by 7 feet with a 4-inch window at the top to let in some natural light. If the inmates become frustrated and act out, their limbs are strapped to their beds for days at a time in a process known as four-pointing. Even former ADX warden Robert Hood has gone on record describing the prison as a clean version of hell. This place is not designed for humanity, said Hood. Has anyone objected? Yes, 11 ADX prisoners have filed a class action lawsuit against the Federal Bureau of Prisons, arguing that prolonged solitary confinement violates the Constitution's 8th Amendment prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. One inmate, Jack Powers, said he was driven so mad by the lack of human interaction that he bit off his own finger and amputated his own testicle. There are instances of people who literally go insane in solitary confinement, and psychology professor Craig Haney said, Psychology Professor Craig Haney, I've seen it happen. Is this happening just at ADX? Not at all. Solitary was once reserved as a way of punishing and controlling the most disruptive or dangerous prisoners in maximum security lockups. Yet in prisons throughout the country, 80,000 inmates are now held in ADX-style isolation on any given day. Prisoners can be isolated for months on end for the slightest of infractions, such as posting something on social media or talking back to a guard. ACLU campaigner Amy Fettig says an increasing number of prison officials in both red and blue states are beginning to recognize that solitary confinement has been overused and abused in the last 30 years. Does solitary confinement work? Studies show that it does not reduce prison violence, and as a form of rehabilitation, it's a disaster. A 2001 study of Connecticut prisoners found that solitary inmates were 50% more likely to be rearrested within 3 years of release than non-solitary inmates. It was meant to make inmates improve, said Maine prison warden Rodney Buford of solitary. The reality is that exactly the opposite happens. That's because long stretches of solitary fill prisoners with rage, make it difficult for them to function in the real world, which they now find overwhelming. See box. Now just 21, Sarnoff, who has no hope of ever being released, will likely never leave solitary unless it is to be executed. He's looking at spending potentially at least 50 years in isolation, said Associate Law Professor Laura Rovner. It's almost unfathomable. Oh my God. Life after solitary confinement. Transitioning back into society after imprisonment isn't easy, and it's even less so after solitary confinement, which research has shown to cause severe psychological damage. Robert King spent a staggering 29 years in solitary in the Louisiana State Penitentiary before being released in 2001 for a 1972 murder he didn't commit. For those 3 decades, King spent every day pacing up and down his 9 by 6 foot cell, counting to himself as he did so. Whenever he was caught trying to communicate with other inmates, King would be placed on a month in the cold box of Camp J, going for blocks of 10 days without any interaction, even with the guards, save for a tray being pushed through a small slot in the cell door. I was depressed every day, he says. The sensory deprivation of solitary has permanently damaged King's sight, and he finds it difficult to judge distances after living in such a small space. More than a decade after his release, says King, he still gets confused as to where I am, where I should be.